In this video, I'm going to show you how to determine the seam allowance. The seam allowance is the distance between the edge of your fabric and where you have your stitching in order to create a seam. So we're going to look at our pattern directions to see what they reference for a seam allowance and then show you how to get it. So let's get started. You want to consult with your pattern directions in order to find out what the seam allowance is. You're going to find this information either on the pattern directions inside the envelope or sometimes it's on the pattern piece itself. What you're looking for is right here where it says seam allowance 5/8 of an inch unless otherwise stated. So that means that your seam allowance for this pattern piece is 5/8 of an inch. This is common for most patterns. Usually 5/8 of an inch is their normal seam allowance. Now, if you'll look other parts of your directions as you're making it, it may say stitch seam at 3/8. So they'll say in the directions then if it varies from the 5/8 seam allowance. But if they just say stitch pant front to pant back, you're just going to assume that the seam allowance then is going to be 5/8 of an inch because it did not state otherwise. I pinned two pieces of fabric together. Here's my pins up here because I'm going to do a seam right along the top here. Now, in order to show you what 5/8 of an inch seam would look like, I'm going to use my sewing gauge here. So this sewing gauge is really nice because it's split up in inches at the top here, and it has this little blue slider here which you can slide up and down for whatever measurement you're doing. So if I wanted to do a 1, I would just slide my slider till the 1-inch mark, and then I would just rest the top of my slider right here on the top of the fabric. So this is my 1-inch mark if I was doing a 1-inch seam allowance. But for my directions, I'm doing 5/8 of an inch. If you look at each inch, you'll see that there's little lines here. These are in 1/8 of an inch increments. So if we need 5/8 of an inch, we're going to count 5 of these lines up from the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to move my slider to the 5/8 inch portion. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use this just to mark where the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance would be. So I'm going to use my marker here. And let me do one more. Alright, so then I'm going to use the straight edge of my sewing gauge here. I'm going to connect these lines. So this blue line represents where I'm going to be stitching on this particular piece of fabric in order to have the 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm not going to do the whole line because you'll see on your sewing machine there's usually a little plate with lines on it that you can use as a guide to keep this edge of the fabric along so that you maintain this same distance. So I'm going to go ahead and break out my machine and show you where that is. So you'll notice there'll be a silver plate here underneath your presser foot next to the feed dogs. On this plate, there's a series of lines. These lines are different measurements you can use as a guide. So what I'm going to do then is take my fabric here with my line drawn in, and I'm going to move it till my needle is right underneath, oops, let me fix this, that line. So I'm just going to move this forward till it looks like it goes right in there. So that goes along then with the second line that I have, this line right there. So I'm going to make sure that when I sew this, the edge of my fabric matches right up to this line. So now I'm going to start at the end, because now I know what I need to look at as I'm sewing. I'm going to line it right up with this line right here. Put on my needle, put down my foot. Now when I get down to my blue line then, this should sew right over it. And then we get to the end And there we go. So there's our seam, and we've done a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Sometimes you'll have to do a seam allowance that does not fall on one of these lines perfectly. Let's say I had to do a 1/2 inch. I'm just going to put my sewing gauge under here. To the edge of my sewing gauge is going to go right to where my needle is, and then I have the 1/2 inch mark marked by the little blue slider here. So that falls right between, right in the middle of this line, this first line, and the second line. In cases such as those, all I'm going to do is I'm going to have to eyeball the edge of my fabric here and to make sure that it stays in the middle. So you're just going to kind of want to use your visuals here to make some sort of key for you to keep looking at. And this is how you keep your fabric straight or your seam straight. So all I'm doing is eyeballing and making sure that I stay right in the middle between the first line and the second line, using the second line here as a reference and knowing, you know, what the distance is and what it looks like. So that's how you do that if you need to do something that's smaller than your lines or larger than your lines. You can also use this outer part here or this part here, as long as you just have something that you can use as a guide. And that's how you do different seam allowances.